Okay, welcome everybody to the Ecological Seminar Series. I would like to thank everyone who helped make this possible. Had a lot of really good support. Merrick McGann from ENSO Seminars was a really big help in helping me hopefully figure out how to get this set up. Fingers crossed. And generally the community was very supportive. And we are very, very excited to have Vicente Raja here with us. Um, to kick off this series. Vicente is a researcher at the Rotman Institute of Philosophy. He works on the philosophy of cognitive science and experimental psychology, plant intelligence. So he does everything from ranging from resonance and neural reuse to philosophy, and is really one of the very exciting researchers in ecological psychology. And he is sharing a talk with us called The Roots and Scope of Ecological Psychology.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you don't see many weird things while I'm doing it. Let me be sure that it is visible in the proper way. Just a second. There you go. Okay, I don't know why you don't see me now. I wish you could still see my face as I work. But anyway, thank you, David, for putting this together. I'm going to be talking about about the root and scope of ecological psychology, and to do so, first, I'm going to tell you about the aims of this talk, and then the talk itself is going to have kind of three blocks. The first block is going to be talking about what happened before ecological psychology, before the ecological approach, and it is going to be based on several relevant aspects of the psychological science before Gibson. Then I'm going to focus more on the Gibsonian approach itself, from perceptual psychophysics to ecological psychology. And in the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think we can do now. And I'm going to use ecological neuroscience as an example of that. So without any more preamble, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the aims I have in this talk. So as you know, we are opening today the Ecological Psychology Seminar series. And for this reason, I didn't want to go to a very specific topic, or I didn't want to be very technical about some specific aspect of the ecological approach. Instead, I want to give you a general but somewhat different perspective on ecological psychology. So to do so, I'm going to try to think the ecological approach without the framing of the cognitive revolution. In other words, I'm going to try to explore the productive aspects of the ecological approach, right? I'm going to try to see ecological psychology not as a reaction or not as an alternative to computational and representational theories, right? I'm going to try to see it on its own and try to explore what's the positive project that can be developed from ecological psychology. To do so, I'm going to be doing something a little bit daring, because I'm going to use more quotes than I would have been in a different kind of talk. But I want you to read the people I'm going to be referring to, and not only to hear me interpreting them. So that said, let's try to talk about what was going on before the ecological approach. To start, I want to give you two biographical notes that I think are relevant for the kind of project I have in here. And one of these notes is that Gibson was about to start his own PhD almost 100 years ago. He actually finished it 94 years ago. I think this is important because sometimes we tend to think that Gibson is kind of in the same generation that people like Chomsky, for instance. Well, Gibson defended his dissertation in the same year Chomsky was born. So he's actually from a previous generation, and it has several consequences. First is that many of the core aspects of ecological psychology, like the criticism of a stimulus, ecological optics, visual control of behavior, etc., were developed before the cognitive revolution became mainstream. Right? So it's not an alternative to the cognitive revolution, right? Everything were developed before that. And where it was developed in a different context, right? In a different theoretical and empirical context within experimental psychology. So I want to tell you a little bit about what this context was and how it influenced the Gibsonian approach. So the first thing that was in the context of psychology when Gibson was still a student was psychophysics and physiology. Just to give you a very simple definition of what these two things are, psychophysics is the study of the lawful relationship between stimulation and experience. A simple example of this is color psychophysics, right? Where you have different aspects of the stimulation, different aspects of light, in this case, the wavelength, that are lawfully related with our experience of color. So if we see a light with the wavelength of 600 nanometers, we see orange. 450, we see blue, etc. Right? So that's psychophysics, relationships of the properties of stimulation and our experience. While physiology is the study of the lawful relation between the activity of the nervous receptors or the activity of the nerves in general and experience. Again, a simple example is color physiology, where we, for instance, know that we don't have a cell that detect each of the wavelengths of all the colors. We actually have three cells, three kinds of cells, right? And the differential activity of them give us the different colors that we can see. So this is, of course, a simple distinction, but it will work for us. In some ways, experimental psychology follows the path of psychophysics, at least at the beginning, while neurophysiology follows the path of physiology. Although this distinction, again, is not always the case. And one example of a psychology that is very, very interested in physiology is William James. And talking about William James, he's one of the fundamental figures to understand the development of ecological psychology. As you all know, William James proposed a way to do psychology that afterwards was called functionalism, and that was more interested in asking what the mind is for than what the mind is. So it was more interested in the functional question than in the ontological one, right? So I'm, of course, not going to give a lecture on William James here, but I want to point out two aspects of the principles of psychology that were a precedent of ecological psychology and that were very important for the Gibsonian approach itself. The first of these aspects is that James thought that relations are real and not built up. and at least some of them are real. And what does it mean? This means that we don't get simple sensations that then we relate in our minds. So we don't need to build up relationships in our mind out of simple sensations. We actually have sensations of relations themselves, like sensations of extension, for instance. So our sensations, whatever we get from the world, are actually more complex than simple events, and some of these sensations are actually of relations, like extension. So this is one thing that is going to be important. The other thing is that James was always very skeptical about psychological explanations. This means that he was skeptical of explanation that appealed to unconscious psychological steps, like unconscious inferences and that kind of stuff. So he thought that explanation should be physiological. So there's something going on in the neurophysiology that allows for explanation, but not psychological, not in terms of inferences, steps, algorithms, and that kind of stuff. And I want to give you a simple example in which he is very explicit about this. In the principles of psychology, in the chapter on the perception of space, he says the empiricist view which Helmholtz defends is that space determinations, that is extension, position, all the spatial properties we can think of, that the space determinations we perceive are in every case products of a process of unconscious inference. The only psychic activity required for this is the association of ideas. So again, we have simple sensations. According to this view, we have simple sensation that have no properties of extension or of position, and we only need to associate them. We only need a few psychical steps in order to explain space perception, right? But then James goes on and says, but how can association produce a space quality not in the thing associated? How can we by induction or analogy infer what we do not already generically know? So James here presses this view, right? He says how it is possible that we have an extensionless, positionless sensation, and only by virtue of psychical steps, only by virtue of mental gymnastics, we can have extension, right? And he goes on and says, this is the point by which Helmholtz's empiristic theory as a theory must be judged, and no theory is worthy of the name which leaves such a point of obscure. But sadly, Helmholtz leaves that point of obscure, and James goes on and says, at one time he seems to fall back on inscrutable powers of the soul and to range himself with the psychical stimulus. A psychical stimulus is Kant, according to James, right? And James says that Helmholtz even speaks of Kant as having made the essential step. So what James is saying is when you appeal to a system that starts with simple sensations and that requires some unconscious inference, you are appealing to some kind of internal powers that build your perception up, like famously Kant thinks that space and times are not properties of the noumena of the real world, but are the forms of our experience. So wrapping up, what you can see here is that James criticized explanations that appeal to unconscious psychical steps, such as unconscious inference. He thought that this explanation had several issues that could not be solved, like the appeal to knowledge that is not there, right? But importantly, this is not an argument against physiological explanations. James thought that there was something going on in the brain uh, during our spatial perception events, of course, but he was against the psychological steps. So how do you get spatial relations and other relations if not by inference? Well, according to James, again, relations are real. These relations are in the environment and they are given in sensation. So our sensation is not only simple bits that are not relative to each other, but we have sensations of relations themselves. If you are familiar with ecological psychology, you can start seeing some resemblance in here, right? So another thing that was happening at this time in the early 20th century, when Gibson was still a student, was behaviorism, right? I'm not going to give you a lecture on behaviorism right now, but you know that it became dominant in the first half of the 20th century. It had a kind of clear methodology based on the stimulus response, reinforcement, etc. And it was claimed to pursue an objective way to understand behavior. So it was also against psychical explanations, right? Explanation that required mental steps to be delivered, right? And the only thing that I want to say here is that beyond the mainstream cartoonish story, there were many ways to understand behaviorism and behavior. So you could be a behaviorist at that moment, and you didn't need to be like Watson, for instance. So there were different kinds of behaviorism, and one of them was the behaviorism of E.B. Holt. E.B. Holt was a behaviorist, but was also a radical empiricist and a neo-realist. He was I assume that most of you know that he was a student of James, but he was also a mentor of Gibson and also Tolman, actually. But here, what is interesting is that Holt is actually the biographical relationship between William James and Gibson, right? And he had another two commitments that were very influential in ecological psychology. James had the commitment regarding relations and psychological explanations, and E.B. Holt had two commitments too. One of them was that behavior is goal-directed and not a function of simple stimulation. In this sense, it was against classic psychophysics and behaviorism, because behavior is not a function of simple stimulation, but of the objective world. So behavior cannot be explained as a chain of responses to simple stimulus, but it's a goal-directed function of the objective world, or some other kind of aspect that is relevant for it, right? And the other commitment is that mind is organized in terms of the organism environment system. You can see this in this couple of quotes I have here. The first quote is in an article called Response and Cognition, and where he says that the fairly accurate description of psychological activity will invariably reveal a law or loss, whereby this activity is shown to be a constant function of some aspect of the objective world. So here, again, the first commitment is stated, right? Behavior or psychological activity is an aspect of the objective world. It's not related to simple stimulation. And then even a more striking similarity with the ecological approach, he claims that the wish is a term he takes from Freud. Here it can be understood as some form of goal-directed behavior, is purpose embodied in the mechanism of all living organisms, that it is necessarily a wish about some feature of the environment. So again, is kind of this relationship to the environment itself and not to simple stimulation. But he goes on and say, a total situation comprising both organism and environment is always involved. Mind is a relation and not a substance. Again, here you find some aspects that may sound familiar to you if you have been exposed to ecological psychology to some extent. So, what I want to say is that there are these different aspects that were at the roots of the development of the ecological approach. These aspects are the fact that relations are real, that the mind itself is a relation, and that these relation, no matter how complex they are, right, or these relations that are themselves complex events in the environment, are given in sensation. The second aspect, the second root, is that psychical explanations are highly problematic. They involve ad infinitum regressions or unjustified prior knowledge. So we should be skeptical of these explanations that involve a bunch of psychological steps like inferences, unconscious, etc. Right? And finally, that there are lawful relationships between psychological events and real objects or aspects of the environment that are possible and that we actually should desire them, right? Of course, this is a very fast way to review all these ideas. If you want to go more deep, you can always check the monumental book by Harry Heft, Ecological Psychology in Context, in which you have all these ideas and many more better presented. So, but having this kind of ideas in mind, now we can move to ecological psychology itself, right? And how it was developed and its relationship to perceptual psychophysics indeed. So we are going to be talking about perceptual psychophysics and ecological psychology, which means that we are back to Gibson. It is important to point out that Gibson himself refers to himself in his autobiography as a Holtian philosophical behaviorist. So some of the pieces that I've been showing you up to now are very clear in his own mind, right? He acknowledged the influence of Holt and the influence of behaviorism too, right? So he was, I think we can agree that he was looking for the loss of experience and behavior at a molar scale. What does it mean, a molar scale? Well, the loss that can be predicated of the organism in terms of the organism environment system, in terms of the total situation. But there was still one more component of the roots of ecological psychology that I haven't addressed yet. This is what he says again in his autobiography in 1967. I did my thesis on the drawing of visual forms from memory to refute the just published results of Wolf at Berlin, students of Kafka's. You know, Kafka was one of the main Gestalt psychologists. The drawings of my subjects differed from the originals only in accordance with laws of perceptual habit. Form perception was learned. Otherwise, one fell into the arms of Immanuel Kant. So again, Gibson was, as James, was reacting to Kant to some extent, but in this specific place, he was reacting to the results within Gestalt psychology. And why? Well, he says, I was a radical empiricist, like Holt, and I add, like James. Little did I know that within 6 months I would be facing Kafka himself weekly across a seminar table. And it is well known that when Gibson finished his PhD, he went to Smith College and he was a fellow professor of Kafka there for a few years, right? So, and this exchange, this weekly exchange with Kafka was very influential for ecological psychology too. So just to say a little bit about it, you know that Gestalt psychology was against simple sensations as well, as James was actually, right? So Gestalt psychology was against simple sensations, against Wundt, against this idea that you can find the building blocks of experience and that they are always the same block and that you only need to combine them in different ways to have different experiences, right? They thought, Gestalt psychologists, that experience is not a bundle of simple sensations and that sensations are not constant in experience. A very simple example of this can be seen in this picture that you can see in the slide. You can think that dots are simple sensations, but actually you have different experiences of the dots depending on relationships between them that are not part of their sensational character or are not part of their simple sensational character. If, for instance, you see the same row, the first row there, you see a set of black dots, but in the second row, you see the same black dots, but they are grouped in such a way that you see 4 groups of 2 dots, right? And the quality of the dots as simple sensations is exactly the same, but their relationship changes. And then our experience changes too, right? So you can see all the other example depending on, you can see different groups in terms of color, size, orientation, etc., right? But the main idea here is that the context and the relative properties of simple sensations actually add something to experience, and therefore experience cannot be seen just as a bundle of these simple sensations. Gibson is actually quite explicit about the influence of Gestalt in his own thinking, and in a letter he sent to Gunnar Johansson in 1970, he says, "What I'm saying, in a sense, is that there are Gestalt laws, and not only for the brain, but also for light." So here, there are some relations in light that actually are relevant for experience. One more time, if you are familiar with ecological psychology, this kind of thinking starts to resonate. But so with all these roots, with James and behaviorism and psychophysics and Holt and Gestalt psychology, Gibson wrote a book in 1950. And in the book, he proposes what he called perceptual psychophysics. Perceptual psychophysics is basically the study of the lawfulness of psychophysics, but not in terms of simple sensations, simple stimulation, but between stimulation and perception itself. So it's the same lawfulness, but at a different scale. He actually, one more time, is explicit about it, right? He claims the policy of searching for a stimulus variable with which some quality of experience may prove to be in correspondence is the policy which underlies psychophysics methods in psychology. It is the first step in the explanation of experience. So he was actually favoring the search for stimulus variables that were in lawful correspondence with experience to to explain it, right? But he thought that this lawful correspondence did not only happen between simple sensations like the wavelength of light and simple experience like seeing red or seeing yellow, right? He thought that there are laws relating perception itself, right, to physical stimulation, as well as laws relating it to physiological processes. So what are these aspects of physical stimulation that can be related to perception itself? So we know that there are laws that relate some properties of light with the sensation of red. But what is the property of physical stimulation that relates to our perception of distance, for instance? Well, there are properties like texture accumulation or texture gradients, right? In this picture you see there, you see a lot of sticks, and these sticks accumulate and look slightly different as they are far away, right? So they give you the experience of distance, so that the bottom sticks are closer to you, and the top sticks are farther, right? So there's an accumulation of texture there that gives you the experience of distance. Or optical flows, for instance, depending on the kind of flow you experience, there are three flows here, right? You can see that your movement and your relationship with the environment is different, right? The top flow tells you that you are kind of in a process of forward locomotion, right? The middle flow tells you that you are approaching to the floor itself, right? And the bottom flow tells you that you are moving in a lateral way. So these flows are also properties of the physical stimulation that tells you about your own relationship with your environment. So perceptual psychophysics is actually the study of the lawful relationship between these properties of stimulation and perception, right? It's one more time, it's not about simple bits of wavelengths or simple bits of stimulation, right? It's different aspects of the stimulation itself, like textures, gradients, and flows, that tells you about properties of the environment, about aspects of the environment that you perceive. This is already in 1950 a step towards ecological optics. There are some changes that happens afterwards to get from perceptual psychophysics to ecological optics, but the fundamental steps of describing physical stimulation in a different way was already taken here. But what is ecological optics? Well, ecological optics is exactly that, but in a more radical way, right? Ecological optics is the richer description of visual stimulation that is actually lawfully related to perception. It is, you can see very clearly the roots towards James relations and Gestalt laws there, right? So the main tenet of ecological optics is that there are environmental properties that are relevant for us, that are specified. This is lawfully related with some properties of the invariants of visual stimulation. I'm going to tell you what these invariants are, but the main thing here is that there's a lawful relationship between the environment and visual and visual stimulation. And there are some aspects of this visual stimulation, some invariants in the flows, in the textures, in the gradients, that are the things that we can use to perceive the environment itself. These invariants are going to be called ecological information by Gibson. And perception itself is going to be a function of environmental events through this ecological information. And here, again, you can see how Holt is in the back, right? So, but this idea of ecological optics and invariance and ecological information can be a little bit abstract. So let me give you some example. What are the foundations of ecological optics without being too technical? Well, ecological optics starts with the fact that light from a source, like from a light bulb or from the sun in some environment, bounces off all the surfaces of that environment, right? Like in this picture here, you have a room with a light bulb. There's a table there, right? So the light travels from the light bulb to all the visible surfaces, and it bounces off. And when it bounces off, it reaches a reverberating structure that is lawfully related to the layout of the environment. Why it is lawfully related? Well, because there are laws of optics that tells you how light travels in an environment, and depending on how on the intensity, the angle, etc., and the position of all the surfaces in the environment, it is going to be bouncing off in a different way, right? So the end here is actually that you have a light structure that depends on the layout of the environment. But what does this light structure means? Another simple example. Here, here you have 4 pictures of the same room with different levels of illumination, right? The top left is the least illuminated, the bottom right is the most illuminated, right? But no matter the general level of illumination there's some structure in what parts of that room get more light and what get less light. For instance, the space under the couch in all cases gets less light than the upper surface of the table. And this is an structure of light there. In all cases, you get less light in some places and more light in other places. And what light and what places get more light or less light? Well, it depends on the layout of the environment itself. If you move the sofa to a different place, the part of the floor that is going to get less light is going to change accordingly, right? So this is the main idea. In any illuminated room, there's always a structure of light. And actually, if you are able to move through this structure, you can find that some aspects of it change as you move, and some other aspects don't change. You can see, by the way, several more examples of this ambient light structure in a very cool paper by Todd in 2020 in Perception. But let's go back to this idea that there's a structure, and when you move, some things of this structure change and some other doesn't change. Examples. Well, the things that doesn't change are invariant. And here you will see a video of an invariant for similar size. How do you know that in this case, although they appear although they occupy a different space in your visual field, how do you know that all the columns are of the same size? Well, because the invariant for similar size is that two objects are of the same size if when they are cut by the horizon line, the relationship between the part of the object that is over the horizon line and under it remain stable. In this case, the relationship between B and A in all cases remains the same, remain invariant. So as you move around, you can find some of these aspects that remain invariant in the structure of light. And these aspects are exactly the ones that tells you, or that gives you knowledge about the environment, like similar size, for instance. Another aspect here is that the properties of the surfaces that surround you as you move in between them changes with your movement. They lawfully change if you approach to the table and to the tree, but they come back to be the same when you make the movement backwards, right? So again, this structure, the light that bounces off from all these surfaces, is, and the changes to it is related to the way you move. Another example, a very simple example of flow. You really don't need many aspects of flow to see that you are going forward and then you turn, right? And you turn right, actually. This is what you see there. Or, for instance, you don't really need to have an edge to see an edge. You just need to see two textures that move differently from each other. So these are four very simple examples of different aspects, different complex aspects of this visual stimulation, this light structure that surrounds us, that give us knowledge about our environments and about perceptual properties of our environments, indeed. And this is, of course, not only a phenomenological account. You can actually have a formal account of this kind of properties. You can have an elegant mathematical account of these aspects of the visual stimulation, and you can see what are the properties of that structure that tells you how to head towards a goal, or that tells you about how something approaches to your eyes, or tells you about height or the opening between two obstacles. I'm not going to say anything deeper about this, as I promised I wasn't going to be too technical, but there are many works by Feyen, Warren, Tresilian, etc., with many formal characterizations of this kind of aspects of visual stimulation. And actually, there's a quite recent work by Tsao and Tsao that aim to give a general mathematical view of ecological optics. They claim, indeed, that our paper is essentially a mathematical translation of the ecological approach to visual perception. We explain how Gibson's theory can be formulated in precise mathematical terms and be implemented computationally. So the thing is that these kind of phenomenological examples I've given you can be translated in formal systems, right? So this leads us to the fundamental idea, or to the core idea in the ecological approach, that is a new description of stimulation in terms of stimulus information. This is ecological optics and ecological haptics and ecological acoustics, right? But this ecological approach to stimulation give us a new description of the different aspects of that stimulation that are actually lawfully related to our perception of the environment. And why is it called ecological? Well, because the other core aspect is that behavior then becomes an ecological event, right? It's behavior is the way the organism environment system self-organize while it is constrained by this information, by this ecological information, right? So organisms move around, and their behavior in their environment is self-organized and is perceptually guided insofar as it is constrained by these variables of the stimulation that give them the proper knowledge about the environment. So, but how is this possible? How are organisms sensitive to this stimulus information that is not simple stimuli, it's not simple sensations? Well, in 1966, Gibson already developed the idea of a perceptual system that, or not a perceptual system, but perceptual systems that are able to detect ecological information. So what are perceptual systems? Yeah, well, they are not passive senses. They are not just the receptors in your retina or your motor receptors, but they are active systems. They are systems that involve your brain, your body, and your behavior. So your visual system, when taken as a perceptual system, it's not just your retina and your optic nerve and your brain. Is that, but it's also your head that is able to move, in a body that is able to locomote, etc. And these perceptual systems are, according to the ecological theory, able to detect these variables of ecological information. They are able to detect these invariants in the visual stimulation or in the sensory stimulation, right? So they don't need any psychological step. This means they don't need to process that information in terms of storing it or coding it or apply an algorithm. As this information is available in the structure of light, they only need to be able to detect it, but not to further process it. So this is the way in which these psychological steps are avoided. And then we can think of behavior in terms of this information. Actually, in a very famous quote, still a little bit obscure, Gibson says that locomotion and manipulation are controlled not by the brain, but by information. Control lies in the organism environment system. The rules that govern behavior are not like laws enforced by an authority or decisions made by a commander. Behavior is regular without being regulated. And the question, the quote actually continues saying, the question is, how can it be, right? But the thing here is that is precisely this information that appears as a structure in the organism's environment system, that behavior can be controlled, but not from the orders of, or from the commands of, a brain, right? So, summing up this second block, at the core of ecological psychology, you find a new description of what counts as stimulation for perception, and a new way to understand the perceptual control of behavior in terms of the organism environment's system. And through these two core ideas, you can see how the relations are real of James, and the mind is a relation of Holt filters into ecological psychology. And finally, it provides what it seems to me to be a lawful way to rethink psychology at its own scale. So far for this rapid review of what ecological psychology is and what tenets there. But you can think then, Vicente, what about affordances? You haven't said anything about them, and affordances are the most important concept of ecological psychology, right? Right? I don't know. I just want to. I don't. I'm not really going to say too much about affordances in here. I just want to say that affordances are a corollary of the theory. So affordances are the last step of the theory, but they are not at the bottom of it, so to speak, right? And why are they a corollary of the theory? Well, because if perception is ecological in the sense of ecological psychology, we need a different way to understand how it is meaningful. Why? Because if environments have these kind of structures that are meaningful for us without needing mental steps or mental stuff like concepts, inference, and the like, we need to understand what these meaningful aspects are. And these meaningful aspects are affordances. In this way, perception is cognitive in the old meaning of the word, right? Cognitive as in delivering knowledge, without cognition in the more contemporary meaning, like in cognition as requiring mental manipulation, etc. But this is everything I want to say about affordances. So we have the roots of ecological psychology. You have these positive core aspects of ecological psychology, in which, if you have noticed, I've never used the word mental representation or anti-representationalism, etc. I've tried to build up the theory on its own and not as an alternative of cognitivism. So what can we do now, right? What can we young ecological psychologists or people interested in ecological psychology can do in this situation? Well, I think there are two other relevant biographical notes, but in this case about us. The first biographical note is that we don't live in 1979 anymore. Sadly, because if we did, we could have been in the Japan concert by Judas Priest, right? But we are not there. So we need to understand that many of the core aspects of ecological psychology have been further developed and empirically tested for over 50 years so far. So we would be naive if we want to build or to look at the scope of ecological psychology from Gibson, and only from Gibson, ignoring all these other developments. Because there have actually been a lot of experimental development in ecological psychology. We even have our own journal. There are new methods based on dynamical systems theory and complexity science applied to ecological psychology since the 80s. There are hundreds of studies on the control of behavior in Connecticut, Cincinnati, etc. And there are hundreds and hundreds of studies too on arguably a few variables of perceptual information like tau. The work that by Dave Lee, Claire Michaels, Bill Warren, etc. And there has also been a lot of philosophical work. In my opinion, there are too many studies of the ontology of affordances, whether they are dispositions or relations, social affordances, negative affordances, mental affordances. To me, it's too many, but that's a word that is there. But there are also a lot of philosophical and theoretical work on the relationship between ecological psychology and cognitivism and representations, computations, etc. Actually, this is the theoretical space in which the typical understanding of ecological psychology as an anti-representational alternative is growing up, and then the relationship between ecological psychology and, for instance, enactivism as another alternative to anti-representationalist. A very good example of this this philosophical work is the book by Manuel Eras Escribano, The Philosophy of Affordances, in which he touches a lot of these topics. So what I want to say here is that you have Gibson and you have all these developments, and I'm in complete favor of pluralism. So I think we should keep doing that, all those things, even the ones I don't like, right? But I think we could also pay more attention to other aspects. For instance, development. By incorporating the work of Eleanor Gibson, that has been not always, let's say, taken care of in the mainstream of ecological psychology, but also the development of the ecological approach towards the social realm, and not only social psychology, but technology, design, architecture, sports. There are many fields in which that has to do with the social realm, in which we need more work in the ecological approach, and also the brain. And I'm the brain because I think we need some form of ecological neuroscience, and I'm going to focus on this one, not because I think it is more important than developmental, the social realm, but because I actually work on this. So I'm sure in following seminars, other people will be able to talk about these other topics, right? So how can the ecological approach to actually approach the brain sciences, right? So I think it is important to resolve a misunderstanding in the ecological approach during the 80s, the 90s, etc. That the rejection of unconscious psychological steps has been taken as the rejection of physiology as a relevant science. This idea that you shouldn't look what is inside your head, but where your head is inside, and that stuff. Well, both James and Holt and Gibson reject psychological steps in explanations, but neither of them reject the importance of physiology. They all agree that the brain is not everything, but it's a part of the perceptual system. And actually, Gibson, it's open about that, right? In 1966, in this famous quote, he says, instead of looking to the brain alone, instead of supposing that the brain constructs or computes the objective information from a kaleidoscopic inflow of sensations, we may suppose that the orienting of organs of perception is governed by the brain, so that the whole system of input and output resonates to external information. So he actually gives a relevant role to the brain in here, and he introduces the main metaphor he uses for the brain and for the activity of the nervous system, right? Which is resonance. He used resonance a lot. For instance, in this figure of the same book, when he talks about perceptual meaning, he talks about an environmental source, a physical law, and a stimulus invariant, like in ecological optics, and then psychological resonance there. And in many other places there, I'm going to give you only one more quote, but there are tens of them. He says, we need to know more about overt attention, as in looking, listening, touching, and so on, and more about the inner central nervous resonance to selected inputs that also occurs, right? So Gibson was not rejecting physiology. He was rejecting, again, psychological steps and conscious inferences. And of course, he was using resonance as a metaphor. He didn't think that the physical process of resonance is happening in the brain. But the fact that he is using that as a metaphor is sometimes taken as an example of resonance being unimportant. But does it mean that resonance is unimportant? Think for a second of the computer metaphor. The fact that we work out under the computer metaphor, or some people do at least, means that we are going to be trying to explain the activity of the brain in terms of inputs, outputs, coding, storing info, algorithms, etc., etc., etc. So the fact that that resonance is a metaphor doesn't mean that if you accept the metaphor, its influence in the kind of science you do is unimportant. And again, the main example is when you operationalize the computer metaphor, you have all the main concepts that you can find nowadays in the neurosciences, for instance. So the questions regarding resonance is not if it is a metaphor or not, but is how to operationalize the notion of ecological resonance, if it is possible to make it something that we can check, and if so, how can we test it empirically? And I've been doing that work for a few years, and I think the main idea here is in Gibson too, when he says the following: the evidence of these chapters, all the chapters in which he's talking about ecological optics, etc., shows that the available stimulation surrounding an organism has a structure. Yeah, we have been talking about that too. But then he says, if the invariance of this structure can be registered by a perceptual system, the constant of neural input will correspond to the constant of stimulus energy. So I want to read this like the invariance of the stimulus energy will correspond to the invariance of the neural activity. But he goes on and says, but then meaningful information can be said to exist inside the nervous system as well as outside. I think this is the closer Gibson gets to give us an operative notion of what resonance is. And I've been trying to make sense of it in a more formal way. So I want to say that ecological resonance happens when the same ecological information that constrains the organism environment dynamics also constrains the brain dynamics. So suppose you are in a situation in which you are a baseball player and you want to hit the ball. Well, we know because of many behavioral experiments that the information that you may be using in this situation is tau, the time to contact, that I'm not going to say anything about it, but only that, you know, that we think that it is plausible that the information a baseball player uses to hit a ball is tau. Well, what resonance says is that if tau is actually constraining the dynamics at the organism environment scale, you should be able to find tau in the brain dynamics too. And it's as simple as that, and I've been defending it for the last few years. More formally, to me, ecological resonance occurs when you have some organism environment dynamics, OED, that are a function of an information psi, and neural dynamics, and they are a function f of information chi. There has to be some correspondence, such as chi is equal to some parameters and psi. This is ecological resonance in a formal sense. To go back to the example, this means that if, for instance, you have a dynamical model that accounts for behavior, the behavior of hitting a ball, that includes a perceptual variable tau, you should find that perceptual variable tau in the dynamics of the brain activity, for instance, in some relevant parts of your EEG data. I take this to be a very explicit hypothesis or operationalization of ecological resonance. It's not against representations, computations, processing, etc. Might be, but it's not framing those terms. And can we test it empirically, well, I want to say actually yes. Actually, it has been tested already. Um, there are experiments of tau coupling between the organism environment system and the brain that I take to be a proof of concept for ecological resonances. Indeed, right? For instance, Ruth van der Bel and Audrey van der Meer have these cool experiments in which they have a baby with an EEG on, and the baby is presented with a looming stimulus, so that they can calculate the tau of this whole situation, and then they measure the tau of the EEG activity. Right? They actually measure the theta rhythm in a dipole in the occipital cortex, because it is related to visual attention and that stuff. But I just want to bring your attention to panel C here, in which in the y-axis you have the value of tau, and in the x-axis you have time. The blue dots is the value of tau in the organism environment system. The black dots are the value of tau in the brain activity, and you can see how they converge to the same value. Or in panel D here, if you plot the value of tau in the organism environment system in the x-axis and the value of tau in the brain signal in the y-axis, you see a very strong coupling between them. So I take that this kind of coupling is exactly saying that the same information that constrains the organism environment system also constrains the brain activity. Ruth and Audrey have a lot of work on this, and very, very interesting work. So I want to say that ecological psychology may be tested, and there are, of course, other many questions open about it, but I think it provides a positive alternative and not just a reactive one. It's not when Ruth and Audrey are doing that, they are not trying to disprove mental representation. They are trying to advance on the ecological approach. So finally, summing up, I think I've been able to show that there's a recognizable and positive project in ecological psychology, that it is based on a new description of what is there to be perceived, and a new description of what's the activity of a perceptual system, and that it can and must be expanded to other realms of the sciences of the mind. I've put the example of ecological neuroscience, but development, the social realm, etc. So thank you very much, and sorry for this long talk.
Okay, wow. What a way to kick off the series. Thank you, Vicente, for that unbelievable talk, and showing that range all the way from the philosophy to the dynamics, and really, really interesting stuff. I'm going to steal the first question as the moderator. And relating back to the early part with James and Holt, when you mentioned about relations, and then as it progressed, going towards ecological optics and invariance, I was thinking, do we have a tendency to think of relations in terms of space? And I feel one of the insights of the invariance is relations temporally, and maybe the reality of relations and transformation. So can you say something about Gibson's treatment of temporality? Obviously, I think it also follows James a little bit there too, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think we tend to think of relations in terms of space. First, maybe because they are very basic for us, right? A big part of our experience is to know what, as David Marr says, is to know what is where, right? So that where part is about the relationships, but also it 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 probably has to do with the sociology of science itself. The perception of distance has been one of the main puzzles of 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 the perceptual psychology since Berkeley, at least, if not more. Right, Descartes. So it's kind of it's an example that has appeared so many times and has been a puzzle and still is in some ways, that it's easy to go to them, right? But yeah, there are other relationships, and for sure temporal ones are very important ones. Actually, they relate to each other in some deep ways, right? So sometimes an ordinal relationship that is a temporal one tells you about the space too, right? um, Also, in effects that Gibson pays a lot of attention to, like the occluding edge, where one thing occludes another thing, but then if keep moving, the other thing appears again. The occluding edge itself is a dynamical relationship. It involves time in a very deep way, right? So 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 yeah, the perception of time itself, uh, I think, is not a thing, for instance, Gibson addresses in that way, in the perception of time as this abstract thing. uh, I can even imagine him reacting to characterizing time in that way. But the perception of events is at the very bottom, right? Perception is always of events, is always temporal, is always dynamics. So it's not a thing. There's no such a thing like the perception of a snapshot and then putting other
Mhm.
snapshots together, right? The perception is always temporal activity and involves time in this deeper way.
Hello?
Yep,
Okay. Just lost you for 1 second.
I'm I'm here. I hope still.
Okay, I think we're good. We're good. Okay, let's go. We have some questions popping up. We have Andrew Wilson. Hi, Andrew. He says, when did directness of perception show up? Gibson gets more interesting about what stimulation is. Does he realize this allows direct perception, or does he want directness and go looking?
Um, I think he, of course, this is a little bit of my take on the writings. I think that Gibson has a strong commitment with the idea that there has to be lawful relationships between perception and the environment, right? This means that there's a relationship between these two terms, and that there's a law at that scale. And I think this is what this, let's say, commitment to what specifically is to provide an explanation, what drives him to the direct theory of perception as we know it now, right? So it's not like he discovers direct perception and then he goes to other things. It's more, he starts from the very beginning, even before he takes the ecological term. So even in 1950, he's looking for direct, unmediated relationships between perception and aspects of the environment, right? So I think because of the influence of Holt, especially, who was very was insisting a lot about, you need lawful relationships. I think in this, if you want, this philosophy of science position of Gibson is what drives him to always refuse to mediation steps, or as I've been calling this in this talk, psychological steps or psychological inference that would make perception indirect, right?
Okay, excellent. We have a question from Jonathan that says, what are your thoughts on simulated energy arrays, e.g. VR, as research tools? How do you think they might open up new avenues for ecological psychology?
I do think so. I think that many psychology departments and also people that work on ecological psychology and that departments are moving towards virtual environments because they allow you to, for instance, to have full control on all these structures that we think constitute ecological information, right? So being in a virtual environment somehow allows you to mess up with those structures and then see whether the perception action loop breaks up and that stuff. I know, though. I mean, I know that there might be some issues with virtual environments, right? Like first, it's not easy to be in, still at least it's not easy to be in a virtual environment for too long. You still get a lot of cyber sickness and that kind of stuff. Also, there are some kind of very very basic aspects of perception, for instance in vision, right? That that there's a convergence point of your eyes out there, right? While when you have a headset, the screens are very close, so the eyes are not fully able to do so. And there are issues, but I think that the pros are way better than the cons. So I mean, I think we can give up some of the issues because of the benefits that we are going to get. And I think it nowadays is kind of unstoppable. I mean, I know people in many departments that are already using VR doing this stuff. So I think that's the way we go. We are actually trying to do so in our own lab, trying to combine VR with EEG to test different stuff.
Good. All right, we have another question about tau in the last experiment. That's the one with the looming study. Wouldn't it also be important to consider the technological setup of the experiment? The fact that the baby is seated and not actively trying to grab the object.
Yes, I think that's a very good question actually. We need to include action in this kind of setups, right? There's again, there are limitations of the experimental setup, like the EEG, for instance. The more you move, the more artifacts you have, and then it's there are all these kinds of stuff. But actually, this experiment I show is a 2009 one. During the last 10 or 12 years, Ruth and Audrey have been doing other stuff, and I know because I've seen other experiments that are soon to be published, that they have included action now. They have a similar experiment, not with babies but with adults, in which they not only have the looming stimulation or the stimulation that provides you a tau variable, but also an interception task. So in this way, in these new experiments they are doing right now, they are actually targeting the question. They are including action in this case. So yeah, super good question and the way to go.
Good. Okay, this is an interesting one from Trevor, and it says, "Is Gibson's account of pickup and invariance suitably constrained? Does direct stimulus mean thought is an attenuation of related stimuli? Is this also the case for memory? What could this mean for memories?"
Yeah. So it is well known that kind of well known. I mean, I shouldn't have said that. Let's say that Gibson talks a little bit about memory, imagination, and what else? Hallucination too, I think. Um, and he wants to relate it to perception itself. So he says at some point, I think it's in 1979, perception is the detection of available um, um, information. Imagination, memory is the detection of information that is not available anymore, and imagination is the detection of information that will be available. Something on those lines. So I think there's no good answer from the ecological standpoint to that question. I know there are ways to try to deal with it, um, but I think that, for instance, try to understand memory from an ecological point of view is one of these things that we could be try to be doing now, right? Um, it's true that Gibson thought that once you accept the ecological theory of perception, it is going to affect how you see all these other mental events like memory and that stuff. Uh, the best thing, I mean, I could speculate, but I don't want to. I think there's work to be done to expand ecological psychology or the ecological approach to memory.
Good. Okay, let's do one more, I think. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. From Ellen, and he says, "You said that affordances are just a corollary of the theory, but how does that jive with Holt's idea that behavior is goal-directed and more generally with functionalism? To me, affordances are central."
Yeah. So, yeah, I think affordances are central too. I What I wanted to say when I said it is a corollary is that it's kind of the final step, right? But in order to affordances to make sense, uh, there are all these steps that are more fundamental in some way, at least more at the roots, right? So there are some steps where affordances are built up, and then affordances become super important for sure, right? But I would say that you probably could give up affordances and stick to ecological information. But if you give up ecological information, affordances become meaningless. And actually, this is one of the problems that the concept has had during the last 20, 30 years, right? That people have used the concept without all these other things that scaffold it, right? So I do think affordances are important. I think that once affordances are there, there's a different way to relate to meaning in the ecological approach, and yeah, I mean, I of course think that we should keep exploring affordances. Maybe not some aspects of it, but I think we should keep doing that. When I say that they are a corollary, I only meant that there are other notions that underlie the notion of affordances, and that actually make that notion of affordance really powerful in psychology.
I guess I'll just build on that and ask, do you think there's some tendency with some of the affordance talk to kind of let a stimulus response framing kind of sneak in, especially like in a very short time window? Where I think when I hear people speak about affordances, it's usually like one single action in one instance, usually always to pick up the famous cup, right? Like
Yeah.
where we have this framing of like a few seconds of action. And I wonder how do you think that meshes with like the emphasis of the nested structure of the environment, like going back to hope and picking up
Yeah.
the scales.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is difficult to talk about affordances, and sometimes we make it very simple, like you said, the graspability of the mug or the walkability of the floor, right? Um, I think that when we talk about affordances in that way, we are doing it because we don't have other way to talk about them. But still, I think that that we should be allowed to talk in that way because we don't have other words, right? There's this famous sidebar in Gibson 1979 that my friend at Bags and me are obsessed with. It's called the perception of affordances is not an object classification, right?
Mhm.
So the thing is that we tend to talk by classifying things, like put it super simply by assigning things to a category, right? This is a
Mhm.
table, this is a speaker, these are books, right? So we that's literally the only way we can talk, right? So when we talk about affordances, we need to classify them too. We need to say walkability, graspability, etc., etc. But affordances resist to the categories. So then we are in this situation in which by categorizing them, we are losing something, right? We are losing, for instance, this nested idea or affordances within affordances, or we lose some of the complexity of our experience,
Mhm.
right? But so far, I'm not sure if we have any other way to talk about them. So
Mhm.
we need to try to be careful about them, but that's it.
Yeah. Excellent. Vicente, thank you so much. This, I think, has
Thank you for
been
having me.
an excellent kickoff to the seminar. Thank you for everyone who helped out and who engaged. And um, this has been a lot of fun and I think very, very informative.
Thank you very much for having me here, and I'm looking forward for the next one.
Yeah, excellent. All right. Well, that's going to end our live stream for today. You can keep an eye on the Twitter page and the YouTube. We'll put up when we have the next one arranged, we'll put it up. And thank you again, everyone. And we'll see you guys next time.